Welcome to the first of our lectures on the topic of Russia and the Soviet Union. This series is, of course, geared towards the New South Wales Board of Studies Modern History course on Russia and the Soviet Union for the HSC. It does assume that you have a general understanding of Russia and, in particular, events leading up to the February Revolution in 1917. And really what we're doing here is picking up from that revolution and understanding the events that unfold. And we'll take it right through to 1941 and the outbreak of war in the Soviet Union as Germany invades. It is important to have an understanding of the far-reaching effects of the February Revolution and the kind of revolution that it was. We need to remember that it was a popular uprising. It wasn't necessarily led by any particular political party, but there were huge factors which had been under the surface in Russian society for quite some time, but a number of elements came together to have this massive outburst of protest that put so much pressure on the system in February 1917 that the Tsar was forced to resign. Here we've got a picture just reminding us that, the real start of it was, I wouldn't say the start, but the start of the end was International Women's Day protests that happened in Petrograd. Working women coming out on the streets, but many other workers coming out in support. And in the days that followed, increasing numbers of strikers and protesters on the streets until the government had effectively lost control. And here we see yet another picture from those February protests, and here we can see soldiers protesting as well, which was a significant element affecting the decision of the Tsar to resign. He could no longer rely on his own army to support him. It's important to just reflect on that so that we understand the events that now happen and the mood of the Russian people as 1917 continues. And it's also important for us as we look and understand the story of what happens to reflect on, ideas and different historians' views and different sources from the time that give us more insight into exactly what was happening, not just what happened, but why it was happening and the impact that that had. And if we reflect on the impact of the February Revolution, we can look here at historian Richard Pipes, who says that the February Revolution had many striking features that distinguish it from other revolutionary upheavals. But the most striking of all was the remarkable rapidity with which the Russian state fell apart. The instant the monarch withdrew, the wires snapped, and the whole structure collapsed in a heap. And that collapse is really important for us to understand what now happens in Russia after the February Revolution. Because it's that impromptu nature. There was no plan of what would happen next. And a really important term for us to remember as we're talking about this is that it created a power vacuum in Russia. And we want to understand who came in to fill that. Because here we've got the Tsar, absolute monarch, complete control, massive bureaucracy underneath his control. What happens when he disappears? That's our power vacuum. There's nothing there to replace it. And so what steps in? We have, first of all, the Provisional government, which had basically elected itself, as we'll see in a moment, and also the Soviet. And we'll talk a little bit more in a moment about what a Soviet is and the kinds of power that they wield. Now, I've deliberately put these two in a particular order on the screen. On the right, which represents the more conservative side of politics, we have the Provisional government, and on the left, the more left-wing, radical approach to politics, we have the Soviet with its basically socialist philosophy. So let's take a closer look at what the provisional government was and what its plans were. It is a body that effectively appointed itself. And it even did this a day before the Tsar actually resigned. But the conservative politicians in the Duma, the parliament of Russia, saw what was coming and saw to try to, take some steps to fill that power vacuum so that Russia wouldn't fall into chaos. And so the Duma basically selected 12 members from itself and appointed themselves as the provisional government. Now remember, that word provisional, of course, means temporary. It's intended to be a temporary government. Most of the members of the Duma, and certainly most of the members of the provisional government that are elected, supported a constitutional monarchy. They weren't necessarily against getting rid of the Tsar. So it's interesting to note that the Tsar resigns the following day, and straight away we move into a situation where we're considering a republic rather than a monarchy, but certainly one with a constitution, a sharing of powers, many greater liberal freedoms. And it is, as I've said, intended to be temporary. So the decision is made on the 1st of March in the old calendar, the Julian calendar, which I use because that's the dates that the Russians were using at the time. One day before the Tsar actually resigns. Now, the members are mostly middle class, moderates, and as I said, supporting greater freedoms and intending to be temporary. The plan is to hold democratic elections sometime in the near future and elect a proper representative parliament to, develop a constitution and actually move forward with a constitutional democracy in Russia. That's the plan. This guy, Prince Lvov, who was from the Constitutional Democratic Party, he is chosen to lead the new provisional government. Now, he wasn't necessarily a high-profile politician. He was known as a moderate reformer, hadn't really held a key position at all, but he was seen pretty much as neutral. He was well respected, and they wanted a well-respected member to lead the new provisional government, but not to necessarily have a strong agenda that might sway the provisional government before it reaches, the planned new constitutional democracy. There was also on the provisional government a socialist, token socialist, you might say, because there had been a number of socialists in the Duma who had been elected by the people onto the Duma. And the guy that goes onto the provisional government is a man called Alexander Kerensky. He's a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, who of course represents the needs of the peasants. So he's a socialist who wants to hand over more land to the peasants and have more reform that supports the peasants. Kerensky was a lawyer and actually had quite a popular profile amongst the workers in Petrograd, even though he was representing the peasants. And one of the interesting things for us to understand is that Kerensky becomes a linchpin. He's not only a key member here of the provisional government, but he was also a member of the Soviet. And we're going to learn more about the Soviet in just a moment. So Kerensky's role on the provisional government, he was the Minister for Justice, being a lawyer. So not necessarily leading the government, but keep an eye on Kerensky. We'll come back to him. One of the things that we've got to understand about the provisional government is where it gets its power from. Remember, I said it's self-appointed. So you've got a question, okay, under which authority is it actually operating? Now, when the Tsar had resigned, officially, power was transferred to the Tsar's brother, Grand Duke Michael. The Tsar resigned on behalf of himself and his son Alexei, but wanted his brother, Grand Duke Michael, to become the new Tsar. Grand Duke Michael thought about it for a day and very sensibly we might say, refused to accept the position of Tsar, which therefore ended the Tsardom in Russia. Uh, it, it is said that Grand Duke Michael handed over his authority to control, to run the country, to the provisional government. But there was certainly a strong perception amongst the people that the provisional government did not have any authority, any power from the people to rule. Now, this will become a problem as time goes on and people are starting to question the provisional government. The provisional government did have good intentions, and a number of reforms were introduced straight away. Basic reforms of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, unions were allowed to exist, people were able to gather, and also they threw in there an amnesty for political prisoners. This is intended to be a new, free Russia, and they're going to forgive all political problems of the past, people who had been, either condemned or, subject to arrest because of their political views. All of that was to be forgiven, and people were now allowed to talk, to discuss, to criticize. This is what became, they talked about themselves being the freest country on the earth. And that is what happened. But there were consequences of this. Consequences for the provisional government. Because if you're giving an amnesty for political prisoners, you're allowing back into the country a whole series of quite radical socialists who had been effectively living in exile. For example, just amongst the Bolsheviks, we are seeing key Bolsheviks who are living in Siberia returning, like Stalin and Kamenev. We've got a number of socialists who are living from different parties, living across Europe, particularly in Switzerland at the time, including Lenin, making their way back to Petrograd. Trotsky had been living in New York at the time. He and a number of other socialists made their way back. We've got Kollontai living in Scandinavia and other socialists making their way back. And there were even socialists living in Australia who are now headed back towards Petrograd. This is an exciting time in Russia's history. The Tsar's gone, overthrown by the power of the people. And we've got exiles rushing back from all over the world to participate and to see what's going to happen next. One of the key decisions that the provisional government makes from the very beginning is that it wants to maintain its commitment to the war. And we can see here on the left the picture, representing the Allies. Russia could not afford to lose its allies, Britain and France. Britain and France had put so much money into Russia, invested so much in Russia in order to support its industrialization. Russia couldn't afford to lose that support. And therefore, there was no doubt from the very beginning for the provisional government that Russia was going to continue in the war effort and support its allies. We can see here, this is where we are during the war. So this is St. Petersburg up here, which of course was the capital, called Petrograd during the war. Remember that all of this area, which was Poland, had been part of the Russian Empire. Already by 1917, the war effort is not going well. And we can see that the line's been pushed right back here. Not so much change down in this bottom quadrant, but certainly a lot of land has already been lost across Poland and into the Ukraine. But the desire to support their allies and the need to maintain British and French support for Russia and Russia's future played on the minds of the provisional government. And so it had a very staunch, strict policy of continuing with the war. But we need to understand the impact that that was having on the real people, the people fighting on the front lines. And this is going to have a big impact. And we'll look at other alternatives of power in Russia in the next mini lecture.